Merci d'être venus si nombreux
Thank you for coming
cette
so numerous
conférence internationale.
to this international conference.
Donc, chers camarades, nous voilà à nouveau réunis.
Here we are once again together,
Francfort, en Allemagne,
like in October 2014 in Frankfurt,
et ce grâce aux camarades de
thanks
l'Institut
to
Schiller,
the Schiller
auxquels nous
Institute,
remercions et saluons
which we thank
l'engagement constant.
and congratulate for their
Nous saluons aussi nos amis de
constant
Solidarité et
commitment.
Progrès, Jacques Cheminade, Odile Maujean,
We also thank our friends from the
Pour leur
Solidarité et
effort
Progrès,
à maintenir le lien
like
entre
Jacques
nous.
Cheminade, Odile Mojon,
Je
and
salue
others.
nos amis
I would
au
also
CARITEM,
greet
comité d'annulation de la
our
dette
friends
entièrement
from the
dans
Committee for the
et
Annulations
qui se
of
battent
Third World Debt,
depuis des années pour dénoncer
CADTM,
l'immense scandale
including Professor
des dettes
Toussaint
odieuses et illégitimes.
and Damien Millet,
Chers camarades, nous avons
who have been fighting for years to denounce the scandal of the illegitimate debts.
et des indépendances africaines. Pour comprendre
We have called our title, our intervention, Fatal Debts, or the Delusion of the Independence of African Nations.
et aux raisons
So
qui ont
to
conduit à son
understand the
développement.
problem of the fatal debt which is assailing the African continent, we have to go back to the origins and the reasons which led to the development
du
of
néocolonialisme,
debt.
il sera aisé à tout
Once we have shown that the African debt is a cleverly orchestrated policy of conquest by neo-colonial forces,
n'est pas une
it will be
sollicitation de la
easy for
générosité
everyone to
financière,
characterize it as
une
odious and
et
illegitimate.
une justice rendue au peuple.
Consequently, its cancellation would not mean generosity,
Tournant des
but
indépendances africaines,
reparation and an act of
dans les années
justice.
1960, les anciennes puissances coloniales
Now, in the 1960s, the ex-colonial countries' powers were faced with two major tasks. One, to prevent the rise of power of any nationalist or pan-Africanist tendencies,
empêcher l'URSS à avoir des alliés en
and to
Afrique,
prevent the Soviet Union at the time of the Cold War
ce qui était juste
from
l'exclusivité
finding an ally in
occidentale.
Africa and thus gaining access to the
Globalement,
mineral
l'Occident a réussi à
resources,
écarter les
which
nationalistes
then belonged to the West.
par des assassinats. C'est le cas de Patrice Lumumba.
Globally, the West had succeeded to get rid of the nationalists either through assassination, as in the case of Lumumba in 1961 in the Congo,
Soit par divers artifices,
or through wars and massacres on a grand scale, such as in the
d'Abel Goumba, en
Cameroon,
1964, après
or through different tricks
59 de Barthélemy
designed to
Banda.
jail or to send in exile opponents such as Abel Goumba in the Central African Republic in
Et profite de la
1964.
moindre occasion pour renverser les pouvoirs afin d'instaurer
Now, in the few countries where the regimes were allied to the Soviet Union, the West maintained a presence and took advantage of the slightest occasion to knock down the powers in place and replace them with more favorable regimes for them.
sur les anciennes
You can recall the assassination of Thomas Sankara.
utilisées est la dette.
Now, the West did everything it could to keep its hand on the former colonies, and one of the weapons it used was the debt,
Alors qu'en réalité,
a pretext in the official discourses for reproducing the success of the Marshall Plan in Africa, while the real reason was to maintain a strategic geopolitical hold and have access to the mineral resources.
contrôle les finances d'une nation n'a pas besoin
So the following adage comes to mind: whoever controls the finances of a nation does not need total control over the internal political power to be the real boss.
phénomène historique ont
It can
permis
pull the strings from behind the scenes.
financiers colossaux pour réaliser sa mainmise sur l'Afrique. En premier lieu,
Now, there have been three historical phenomena have given the West the means to get its hold on Africa.
issu des prêts de dollars faits par les États-Unis aux Européens dans les années 1950.
First, you had in the 1960s, the Western private banks had a lot of euro dollars resulting from the loans that had been granted to the Europeans in the 1950s in the context of the Marshall Plan.
provoqué dans l'économie
Now,
américaine
to prevent those euro dollars from returning to the United States,
de l'or
not only because of the inflation it would cause, but also because of the risk of losing gold out of the United States.
Les Occidentaux vont inciter leurs banques
So the Western governments, to prevent that, encourage their banks to lend massively at very advantageous rates to the new and nominally independent African countries.
les régimes africains
Naturally, the African regimes from which the Western powers had secured allegiance were very interested in getting these loans, but particularly for their own personal use. And a second historical phenomenon which can explain the explosion of the debt was the oil shock of 1973, which suddenly quadrupled the price of oil. The emirs of the Gulf then deposited these vast quantities of dollars into the Western banks. This was the phenomenon of the so-called petrodollars. And these petrodollars on top of the eurodollars linked to the reconstruction of Europe again flowed toward Africa. So from 1960 to 1920, the private part of the Third World debt exploded. From almost zero at the beginning of the 60s, it reached $2.5 billion in 1970, and then $38 billion in 1980. Now, the third phenomenon related to the explosion of the debt is what we call binded aid. That is, it's bilateral aid between two states directly. And in fact, that is an indirect subsidy for the Western firms whose interests are served by the African people. The practice goes back to the crisis that hit Europe in the year 1973-1975, and which is known as the end of the 30 glorious years of growth.
En fait, pour trouver des débouchés aux marchandises qui ne trouvent plus preneur en Occident,
and then to find market opportunities for products which no longer could be sold on Western markets, the idea was to grant loans to be used exclusively for the purchase of goods produced within the creditor countries, even if they were more expensive or ill-adapted to the development plan of the purchasing economy. From $6 billion in 1970, the bilateral aid exploded, reaching $36 billion in 1980. So from 6 to 36 billion, from 1970 to 1980. Anybody who has closely followed this evolution will come to the conclusion, as we have, that all of these initiatives have nothing to do with the generosity and the concern for development of the continent, especially since these huge transfers of wealth were despotic, corrupted, and venal. The Cold War, the pumping of raw materials, and the binded aid have been used to justify the financial and even military support of a bunch of villainous dictators who were a danger for their people. You have Idi Amin Dada in Uganda, Mobutu in Zaire, Mengistu in Ethiopia, Samuel Doe in Liberia. They all competed with each other in terms of brutality, spending for themselves, and their total indifference toward the most elementary and fundamental needs of the population. Now, in 1977, we will recall that Bokassa was coronated, a good friend of Giscard d'Estaing. And that coronation cost 1/5 of the annual budget of the Central African Republic, 22 million euros. The gigantic embezzlements of money operated by Mobutu and deposited in Western banking accounts amounted to almost $8 billion, while the debt of Zaire at the time of his fall in 1996 was $12 billion. Now, we also have the Western banks and the Western states for their bilateral binded aid. In addition to that, we have to mention the IMF and World Bank for the multilateral part of the debt. The multilateral part of the African debt was $1.2 billion in 1970 and $15.5 billion in 1980. Private debt, bilateral debt, bilateral debt. Altogether in 1980, the African continent was overburdened by $89 billion of debts.
Sans système éducatif,
But it had no viable health system, no infrastructure, no educational system. Misery was increasing. So what happened to that $89 billion borrowed by the government? Where was the human development? In 1980, you will recall, African debt was denominated in dollars, in French francs, in Deutsche Marks, in sterling pounds, and in yen, which forced the African countries to secure strong currencies to reimburse the loans accepted.
Cependant, sous l'effet conjugué de la chute des cours des matières premières et de la hausse brutale.
However, under the combined effect of the drop of prices of raw materials and the steep increase in interest rates on the dollar or the pound at the beginning of the 80s, African countries, just like the rest of the Third World, were unable to reimburse their debt, totally unable. Thus, you had the debt crisis with the emergence of shock therapy, the harsh medicine ordered by the IMF, World Bank duo, the Paris Club, the London Club, and consorts.
Son impossibilité de rembourser la dette à cause de la baisse du prix des matières
premières. Now, in 1982,
Mexico
had announced publicly that it was incapable of paying the debt due to the fall in the price of raw materials and the explosion of interest rates. And most African countries did the same. And this crisis led to the strangulation of these countries, the more so that Western banks refused to grant new loans as long as the old debts were outstanding. So to prevent the successive bank failures that were in the making, the IMF and the industrialized countries granted new loans to keep the private banks afloat.
C'est l'effet boule de neige.
It was called the snowball effect, consisting of contracting new loans to around a rollover of the old ones. But the new loans were conditional on the submission or the acceptance of structural adjustment plans, leading to the outright loss of sovereignty on economic matters.
Au début des années 1990,
and since the 1980s, including after the return of the multi-party system at the beginning of the 90s, the structural adjustment plans are leading to massive losses of income, the brutal freeze of job creation, the interruption of subsidies to basic services such as health, electricity, water, education, the privatization of state enterprises, and massive layoffs.
Devraient subir la double peine.
So the African people have had to endure a double punishment.
Sur l'autel des remboursements des
In addition to the torments of dictatorial regimes, they are sacrificed regularly to repay odious and illegitimate debts contracted by those same unjust regimes.
Le remboursement des dettes contractées pour les achats d'armes de guerre.
And the cynicism is reached new heights when the population is forced to suffer and to repay debts contracted for the purchase of military continent, which have caused thousands of deaths on the succession of conflicts on the continent. According to UNCTAD, between 1970 and 2002, Africa received $554 billion in loans, and $550 billion have been repaid. And yet this debt is still standing at $295 billion today. Now, according to the CADEM, for sub-Saharan Africa, the outflow of money through debt service and the repatriation of profits from transnational enterprises is almost equivalent to the inflow of money related to development assistance and the money sent back by foreign workers. In 2012,
de la région
the profits
de la planète a représenté 5% de son PIB.
Returned from the region which is the poorest in the world amounted to 5% of its GDP, while development assistance amounted to only 1% of its GDP. So who is helping whom?
C'est pourquoi un audit de la dette africaine est une exigence.
That's why it's so necessary to have an audit of the African debt.
L'audit citoyen consiste à analyser de manière critique.
As an instrument of sovereignty, an audit should analyze in a critical way the loan practices followed by the officials in power and to answer many questions. For example, why has the government contracted a debt which is always increasing? For which political choices and which social interest has the debt been contracted? Who has benefited from it? Would it have been possible to make a different choice? How much interest was paid? What rate? What portion of the capital has been repaid? How did private debts become public debts? The threat of proscription by the international community is only one way to discourage public officials from going forward with such practices. Because, contrary to popular belief, the recent work by two economists, Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff, has counted 169 payment defaults, which have lasted on average 3 years, between 1946 and 2008. But our organization, the Pan-African League-UMOJA, is conscious of the fact, is aware of the fact that the issue of the African debt is one that is eminently political. It is not sufficient to want or to claim an audit of the debt. We need a balance of power advantageous enough to make sure that the African states take this road. That is why it is a Pan-African goal. Thank you very much.